title is Why Tony Benn Should Be a Socialist. To me, it's a wee bit of a crazy title, but nevertheless, the reason it was decided to take this one is apparently Tony Benn spoke here on why you should be a socialist. What I intend to show very briefly, because I'd rather have questions and points of view and discussion rather than me rabbiting on, is what I intend to show, first of all, the most important item as far as the Socialist Party of Great Britain is concerned, namely what socialism is. Secondly, to try and point out or illustrate, or at least get you thinking about the subject that we hold, namely that the Labour Party is not a socialist party and never has been a socialist party, and never will be one. Thirdly, to show that the individual concerned, although I'm not really all that concerned about him as an individual, is not a socialist and is in fact a supporter of the buying and selling system. And last of all, of course, most important of all, from the standpoint of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, how to get socialism. So first of all, what socialism is. This morning, along with a comrade of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, I had a look at the university bookshop across the road, and I wasn't astounded, amazed, or astonished to find that there was umpteen pamphlets and periodicals all claiming to be socialist. I would have found the same and have found the same any time I spoke in Liverpool or Manchester or Glasgow or Edinburgh or anywhere else in the British Isles. And no doubt if I was privileged enough to manage to get the cash together and go and speak in America or anywhere in the continent, I would find the same thing. There's a tremendous multiplicity of claims of what socialism is. So I'd like to get that one out of the way first of all. The Socialist Party start in the sort of ABC of their case by defining what we mean by capitalism. What we mean is something very specific and definite. We mean a social system, as it happens a worldwide social system, based on commodity production by wage labour. No matter what the claims may be made in various parts of the globe, in the USSR, or in the Republic of China, or Castro's Cuba, or elsewhere about having socialism, or something different from capitalism, we say that capitalism can always be understood by the fact that all wealth takes the form of commodities, that is, articles produced for sale on a market with a view to making a profit. And no matter where you look in the world, you will find that everything's produced for sale. You've got production for sale, production for profit. And that's as true as the USSR as it is of the USA. The modern capitalism stretches from the North Pole to the South Pole, from the Rockies to Siberia. It's a worldwide social system. And you can always tell it by the fact that everything's produced for sale. That it's a class society where we've got a group of people who own all the means of producing and distributing wealth. That is the factories and the workshops, the mines, commercial undertakings. And another group of people, the large majority, who basically own nothing but their ability to work. And in order to live, I've got to work for a wage, a salary, or a commission. That class division is peculiar to modern capitalism, and it exists all over the world. We say further, because we've got a society based on production for profit, you inevitably have the problems of war, and of poverty, and of crime, and all the other social problems. We claim that there is no way you can run this buying and selling system that would in any way alter those problems. That war is inevitable, that poverty is inevitable, while you have a buying and selling, profit-producing society. So that when we talk about socialism, we mean a complete transformation of that. We do not mean nationalisation, nor do we mean some form of state control, or a very strong central government, or the state owning everything. What we mean basically is a new society wherein the whole earth, the whole planet, everything in it and on it, all the means of producing and distributing wealth, will be owned in common with the whole world's population. We mean a society without buying or selling. We mean a society without ownership. The whole concept of private ownership is completely foreign to the Socialist Party of Great Britain's viewpoint of world socialism. Just as today we would think it would be insane to sell the air we breathe, and that you would not be allowed to breathe it unless you had a certain amount of a means of exchange in your pocket, so inside a socialist society it would be impossible to sell food, clothing, shelter, entertainment or information. Everything inside a socialist society would be produced solely for use. It is fundamentally a society for production solely for use. A society with no classes, because classes are economic groups who have an interest opposed to another economic group. Inside a socialist society, we envisage no countries and no borders. Now that very briefly, and I've no doubt I've got a lot of disagreement on that, but I don't want to labour the point. I'll leave that to you, and I'm quite sure that those who disagree or misunderstand, or both, will take me to task on it. On to the second part, about the Labour Party not being a socialist party. We would claim that the history of the Labour Party, and again, rather than illustrate this at this point, we'll deal with it in questions or discussion. But enough and suffice at the moment for us to state this, our view on it, that the Labour Party are not in favour of the abolition of the buying and selling system. We could take any election address of the British Labour Party and find in effect that what they were after was to reform the present social system. They would claim they wanted more jobs, or they wanted to do something about the plight of the aged, or they wanted to do something about education programmes, or they wanted to do something about the health service. But you can search their election address from top to bottom, there will be nothing in it about abolishing the basic cause of the problems, that is international capitalism. And of course, it's not just a theoretical question here, because we have had Labour governments, and we have found when we had Labour governments, they've supported wars, they've supported peacetime conscription, they've supported the nuclear programme, the nuclear armaments, the British owning class. They have used troops against strikers. They've introduced wage freezes, pay pauses, and all the rest of it. In other words, they've done everything that the modern Conservative Party have done, and they've done everything that the old Liberal Party done in power. They have behaved exactly the way they are, namely a political party that wants to run British capitalism. And in more honest days, they had their leaders, Mr. Gaitskell, who would boldly state, as he did in the Manchester Guardian, that the Labour Party stands to run capitalism a little more fairly than the Conservative Party. That's the viewpoint. And it's no miracle that that's the case, because as I say, if you look at their election address or their history, that is what they've always done. But another thing that they've always done, of course, is they've always had wild men on the left. In fact, to look at the British Labour Party and to look at the careers of the great men in the Labour Party, the Bevans, the Gaitskells, the Wilsons and so on, is like reading a piece of English prose. It reads from left to right. The wild man becomes a statesman. That happens all the time. None of the present wild men are liable to be anything different. Because basically, the Labour Party is an opportunist, reformist political party that wishes to gain power, and gain power any way they can. And the individual that this happens to be dealing with, Mr. Wedgwood Benn, or Tony Wedgwood Benn, is likewise, as a loyal supporter of the Labour Party, he must be tarred with the same brush. Namely, he is a supporter of the buying and selling system. In the Socialist Standard of January this year, there was an interview with Mr. Benn, in which they dealt with one of his books, called Arguments for Socialism, and a couple of socialists here asked him several questions. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, he talks about socialism will have investment. He even goes so far as to say, I've never heard the argument used that socialism would abolish the concept of investment. Well, that's unfortunate, because socialism means the end of investment, the end of profit, the end of wages, and the end of prices. And it's not just a case here of having a contrary view to the Socialist Party of Great Britain. It's an extremely confused one. For instance, when asked about the record of the Labour Party, he could say this. In 1959, the Labour Party was persuaded to abandon socialism on the basis that capitalism would always give you growth, welfare, full employment, and so on. There's a lot of confusion here about just exactly what he means by the term socialism. Not that he's unique in that respect, of course. The Daily Express under Beaverbrook's son during an election time would always talk about the Labour Party as being a socialist party. To such an extent they would even distort the TV programmes or the radio programmes and change party political broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party. They used to always change it to the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party of Great Britain, I don't know how often, would take them to the Press Council to try and get them to correct this. But of course it never worked. It's rather like going to the Police Federation and complaining about how the police behaved in Glasgow one Saturday night. Rather pointless. In fact, I think the Socialist Party gave up the whole exercise after a couple of years at it. Now, that idea of socialism, from time to time in certain areas, under certain conditions, members of the Labour Party will claim that they are socialists. And, they'll say certain words that would lead to you believe to think it's something to do with socialism. But in real practical terms, they're absolutely opposed to the concept of world socialism. Now, from our viewpoint, by far the most important thing for members of the working class to get to grips with is this: how to get socialism. Because basically, of course, that's where the Labour Party and the Communist Party and all these other organisations are completely out of step with us, or our opponents would say we're out of step with them. Namely, they believe that a group of very clever men, dedicated men, extremely smart, can get to power inside British capitalism or some other country's capitalism, and by a series of very cunning legislation, gradually get rid of capitalism. In fact, he used to use the term, Keir Hardie, so beloved of the Labour Party, used to use the term that socialism will come like a thief in the night. Well, the Labour Party was formed in 1906, and it's been a very long, cold, wintry night, because we're no more near it now by their efforts than they were when we were formed in 1906. We placed all our emphasis on this one proposition. Socialism means the common ownership and democratic control of all the world's resources by all the world's people. That's what it means. And because of the nature of a socialist society, namely it's democratic and it's based on common ownership, what is needed to bring it about is majority understanding. The Socialist Party of Great Britain are absolutely opposed to the concept of leadership, whether it be a Hitler, a Stalin, a Wilson, a Foote, a Gaitskell, a Thatcher, or whatever. All of these people are what are called political leaders, and there is only a need for a leader when you have people who don't know where they're going. To give you a very simple illustration, on a Saturday evening, if you had to be preparing yourself to go out to go for a drink, you would take it rather harsh if I appeared in the scene and said, "Oh, this is your Saturday night. This is your night out. Right, good. Follow me. You'll drink the following: Drambuie and Guinness. You'll do this, you'll do that. You'll play these records. You think it rather strange that I should attempt to tell you what to do with your leisure. If we happen to go to a dance hall and we had to get in Glasgow what we call a lumber, that is, if we hit it off and get a young lady to go home with us, you'd look upon it rather strange if some individual who turned on all that charm had to take the lady to her back gate, or in Glasgow the back close, and then say, just a moment, my darling, and walk out in the street and say, my friend, I wonder if you would do a loving for me. You'd think that insane. In fact, you'd be a bit of a pervert if you were engaged in anything like that. So you wouldn't let someone do your drinking for you. You wouldn't let someone do your loving for you. But this concept that the working class have got, a slavish one, that you're going to let someone else do your thinking for you, is a thing that's exploited by politicians of every hue throughout the political spectrum. This concept of leadership is the absolute opposite to the concept of a society based on common ownership and democratic control. It's not a question here of the Socialist Party of Great Britain being ultra-democratic because we're nice guys and nice gals. It's not a question of that. It's because the nature of the society determines the way you get it. You cannot bring about a society based on common ownership and democratic control if you go along with this concept of leadership. The old Bolshevik party used to talk about the ends justifying the means. That this beautiful goal they had, well, because it was such a beautiful goal, then of course they were allowed to rob, to cheat, to imprison, to torture, to maim and to kill. That was the viewpoint of the Lenins, the Stalins, the Trotskyists, right through up till present day. That anything justified this wonderful goal that you're getting. But we look at it the other way. It's not a question here of the end justifying the means. The end determines the means. If you're going to have a workable society based on common ownership and democratic control, the organisation seeking that, in turn, must be a democratic political party. And that is why, since it was formed in 1904, the Socialist Party of Great Britain never has had a leader. The Socialist Party of Great Britain has never had secret meetings. Every meeting of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, from a local branch meeting to a meeting of the Executive Committee, is open to the public. Because the nature of socialism determines that we must act in a democratic fashion. Now, to the critic of the Socialist Party, such as Mr. Benn, who calls us purists, something that the Labour Party could never be accused of, who calls us impossibilists and tells us that we should adopt a practical policy. Well, the Labour Party have been adopting this practical policy since the formation in 1906. The wars have not lessened, they have got worse. The gap between rich and poor has not lessened. Relatively, it's got greater in relation to the wealth that is now produced. And all the social problems that they set out to deal with, such as crime, are a much lot worse. For instance, even the most nightmare Labour Party in 1906 could never have dreamt of this morning's Guardian, where they're putting forward this view that what would happen in the event of a limited nuclear war. And the quote at the Royal Society of Medicine, this group called the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, a guy called Professor P.J. Lindrop of Bart's Hospital here in London. He goes on to project what would happen in the event of a nuclear warhead striking one of these places like Windscale or something like that. And he said after it, the conference, composed of doctors, the conference unanimously endorsed the view that organised medical intervention, bringing medical assistance to those in urgent need, will not be possible in nuclear war, as there was no effective civil defence. Now that's the kind of nightmare world that's brought about by what the Labour Party would call practical policies, the Something Now Brigade. There is no way that these problems are going to lessen as long as the members of the working class leave their thinking and their action up to people who are committed to protecting the buying and selling system. So this afternoon we ask you to consider a revolutionary proposition that we have a new society based in common ownership. That's not the conclusion, of course, unfortunately, of this wrongly called organisation, the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, because it says here in conclusion in this article that Professor Michael Lecher of the Disaster Epidemiology Centre at Louvain, Belgium, called on a conference to seek a new ethical view by the medical profession and its attitude to weapons of mass destruction. Well, ethics or morals do not enter into it. The reason that armies cross borders, the reason that nuclear warheads are released, is because we live in a competitive world, where the American capitalist class are in conflict with the Russian, the British, the German, and all the other capitalist classes, that this conflict over markets and trade routes and military bases, despite all the ethical humbug that's put out by the doctors here or the priests or the parsons, that the reality of the situation, the practical consideration here is world markets, trade routes and military bases. And that was so much recognised the way back in the last century that it was well known. Nobody ever kidded anybody on that the job of the Minister of War was anything other than to protect the British capitalist class interests abroad. The reason that armies cross borders is to protect private property owned by a certain group against another certain group. And the awful tragedy of it, of course, and all the wars up to date, the next one may be a little different, of course, is that it's the working class who are the major victims of these conflicts. And at the end, at the cessation of hostilities, then of course, once again, they have lost the war. The British working class in 1945, far from finding themselves the victors, having had to undertake such things as being bombed in their towns in London or Coventry or Glasgow or Clydebank. Some of them found, especially in the area of the world I come from, in the Glasgow and Clydebank area, having been bombed, they found that later on in the late 50s, early 60s, in order to get a job in the shipyards, they had to go over to Germany. Because this is the thing about capitalism. It doesn't worry about national boundaries. Wherever there's a profit to be made, wherever it's possible to get surplus value from the working class, then they will cross it with their investments. So we would ask you, as I say this afternoon, to consider the case for world socialism as put forward by the Socialist Party of Great Britain and our companion parties in the United States of America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and in Austria and Ireland. We'd ask you to consider the revolutionary proposition. But to the charge that perhaps we are being, as Mr. Foote accused us of being religious, pure, evangelical, and not being practical, we would say that the case for socialism is in line with the way society is developing. In other words, it's not only the voice of the Socialist Party of Great Britain and its companion parties, rather like a voice in the wilderness crying out here, that there are other things that are leading people to socialist ideas. That is the very development of capitalism itself. Some of the great enemies of the socialist case, because the Socialist Party is a relatively old political party, formed as it was in the beginning of this century, 1904, some of their great enemies have disappeared. One of the major ones, for instance, was the religious bigotry of the working class. I'm well aware, of course, that that still exists. that the Pope at Easter gets up and speaks outdoors, is greeted with something like 250,000 people. He's not greeted by a handful of people as I am this afternoon. But nevertheless, that tremendous sway of religious superstition is failing. And it's not failing because of the efforts of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, oh that it were. It's failing because of the development of capitalism itself. Likewise, the attitude towards authority and authorities as being the holder of all knowledge, to a very large extent, finds itself disappearing. The politicians can no longer come along in wartime or other crisis period and say, well, we want you to die for your king and your country. You'll have to think up something a little more subtle than that, your way of life perhaps, something of that nonsensical stature. But nevertheless, the changes inside capitalism are acting towards a growing socialist knowledge on behalf of the working class. We would say further that the great technological advances of the last 20 years, that there is only one society that can encompass that. That this tremendous step forward in electronics, there's basically only one society that can embrace these new ideas. Short of being Luddites and trying to hold back developments, and we're well aware of the working class are far from being progressive in this fashion, that trade unions, because they are basically defensive mechanisms, and certainly not revolutionary, have fought against the technical developments. That in the newspaper industry for now, they're in a great battle for their very livelihood to stop technical advances in modern society. But nevertheless, by the nature of capitalist society, these will come about. They will come about because in the drive for profit, they're the only way to have them. But of course, it'll become more and more apparent then that that amazing amount of wealth that modern capitalism is capable of producing is being destroyed, and people are going without. In the local newspaper on Sunday, before coming away from here, a rag of a newspaper called the Sunday Mail, they were up in arms about the fact, because of EEC agreements, in Peterhead in Aberdeen, the fishermen were sending the fish back out and throwing them back into the sea. At the same time as a third of the world's population starves. Capitalism used to be a progressive step forward. It broke away all the old fetters of production that feudalism had. But now, by its very development, it's now in a restrictive period where it stops innovation, where it stops progress, where it stops the creation of new means of production, and also where it has this tremendous contrast between people who are going without things and at the same time wealth being destroyed. So we would ask you to very seriously consider the proposition that the Socialist Party of Great Britain puts forward. We're not so interested in Tony Benn becoming a socialist, we're more concerned about you becoming a socialist. And of course there's nothing I can say or do really that'll make you a socialist. You don't convert people to socialism. That's a process that goes on in your own head. You've got to figure it out. You've got to work for it. You've got to look at the arguments and decide whether they're valid or invalid. That's the only way to be convinced and become a conscious socialist. And we would ask you, in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I've tried to be as brief as possible. I hope I've not went on too long, and I hope I've got a lot of questions. We would ask you what this social system, with its wars and threats of wars, with its poverty, with its racial and religious bigotry, has ever done for you that you should continue supporting this social system. We ask you to seriously consider the case for a new world socialism. Thank you.
I'd like to come back to the first part of your speech where you said, how do we get socialism from the SPG point of view? In respect, you did not answer that question. You continue to talk about the problems of capitalism, but you did not state what the Socialist Party of Great Britain point of view is how we shall see worldwide socialism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if first proposition is you've got to know what is socialism. Socialism means the whole earth, everything in it and on it owned in common. It means that the population as a whole have democratic control over all the means of production and distribution. That's what it means. Now we claim, the Socialist Party of Great Britain claims, the only way to get that is when a majority of the world's working class are in favour of it. That there's no quick roads to it, you can't be led to it, something you can be led to, you can be led away from. So we place all our emphasis on working class understanding. Towards that end, all we as a political party can do is produce literature, have meetings, have debates, from time to time contest elections, and try and publicise the case for world socialism. But as I said, that's not the only agency working for world socialism. The very development of capitalism forces people into looking to an alternative from the present society. Once a majority are in favour of world socialism, what they've got to do is take hold of the state machine. In other words, it'd be pointless for the members of the working class to do what some romantics in the left wing and the anarchist movement say, that is attack a modern state machine with all its tremendous technical advance in weaponry and so on, with bottles and chains and half bricks and all the things that working class are liable to get a hold of. We say the only way to do that is democratically through the ballot box. In most developed capitalist countries, not in them all, but in most developed capitalist countries, we already have a way to do that. In other words, we say that socialism could be established in most capitalist countries through the ballot box. Because one, the only way you'll know if a majority are in favour of socialism is count them. And voting's a very good way to do that. Plus the fact that if you leave the state machine in the hands of the spokesman for the owning class, then it'd be impossible to get socialism, because they would be liable to use that state machine against the democratic wishes of the majority. So we claim all we can do as an organisation is propagate the case for socialism. Once a majority are in favour of socialism, what we'll have to do is capture the state machine and declare private property illegal.
Yes, I'd like to think back. The SPGB have been in existence for 76 years now, and well, you certainly have had no MPs, have you?
No.
No. And of course, you're talking about Labour and its existence for 74 years, doing very little for socialism. My point is that when will the people of the world see the need for socialism, and when will they start to support you democratically? And how can they support you democratically in places like Russia where ballots are not there, and in fact ballots in this country are not there? And how do you propose to change that system so it will be in favour of the SPGB?
Ballots not here in this country, did you say?
Yes.
Well, it's true this...
Would you describe voting in this country as democratic?
Well, it's true we've been in existence since 1904 and we've had no MPs. The reason for that is the majority of the working class are still in favour of capitalism. They're in favour of the buying and selling. They're in favour of the leadership attitude. When you say that Labour, quoting me, that Labour have done very little for socialism, I didn't say that. They've done absolutely nothing for socialism, except confuse, except mislead. Now, you ask me an imponderable question. You say to me, when will we support you? I don't know when that'll happen. That's only you can decide that. Now, the question is, at present, there's a set-up in Great Britain and France and Germany and the developed Western Europe where a majority of the working class can express their viewpoints through the ballot box. That exists at present. It's true it's a limited democracy, in the sense that obviously rich men have the control of newspapers, radio and TV and so on. But nevertheless, granted a majority being in favour of socialism, they could get it through the ballot box. Now, in those countries that have not even got that limited democracy, South Africa and Russia and China and so on, and that so-called communist Eastern Bloc that have not got it, well, the workers there, of course, will have to struggle in order to get that. The best thing we can do for them is to propagate the case for world socialism. Let's face it, that's all we can do. It's up to the intelligence and up to the courage of members of the working class and their efforts only, to bring that about. But on your question, when will you support us? Well, I just don't know that. We've not got a crystal ball, or as one comrade of mine used to say about, unfortunately, we haven't got crystal balls. And the thing about it is, I just can't prophesise that. What I can say is this for definite. Until a majority of the working class understand and organise for socialism, we shan't get it.
Well, can you come back in a second?
You were saying that when the majority of the working class supports socialism, the next step, or the need for socialism, it will be necessary to seize the state machine, or seize control of the state machine. Surely, I mean, the state machine, in fact, because what it actually consists of is a large number of working class people being paid wages to carry out functions on behalf of the ruling class. And so logically, once the vast majority, have been convinced of the need for socialism, then surely, I mean, you're going to get, I mean, as the Socialist Party says, war doesn't serve working class interests. You'll get massive resignations from the army. You'll get massive resignations from the civil service. There won't be a state machine left, surely, if you convince people of the need for socialism. People will just abandon it, because the vast majority of people who work in the state machine are in fact working class themselves. They have no property. It's not in their interest. Once they're convinced of that, why do you need to keep talking about seizing the state machine? It surely can disappear of its own accord.
Yes, well, of course, on those occasions when members of the working class have attempted in any way to endanger the property relationships, and from time to time have had uprisings and so on, no socialist revolutions, unfortunately. What we have found there is that any attempt to overthrow the state machine by use of violence, or any attempt to ignore the state machine, so it'll just disappear. I mean, an anarchist viewpoint is that it'll just disappear. We don't have to worry about that. We'll just have an alternative society, rather like the old cooperatives or the old Owenites. We'll just have our own little society and ignore this tremendous power they've got. Well, that's doomed to failure, because what we're dealing with here is people who are going to try and hold on to their property relationships. Now, it's quite true what you say, of course, that the vast majority of the armed forces are composed of members of the working class, and the judiciary, the jailers, the wardens and all the rest of it are in actual fact members of the working class. That's true. And of course there's going to be a difficulty with a growing socialist consciousness, just how they're going to organise their state machine. But nevertheless, for us to leave that in their hands would be very, very dangerous, especially with such technical advances as nuclear weapons and so on. We think it's absolutely essential, at the best as an insurance policy. Maybe it's the best to make sure of no annihilation is to get hold of that state machine. And as I say, in Western Europe and in the Americas and that, constitutionally, you could do it. At present, of course, they don't. At present, of course, the working class of the world votes for political parties that are going to run the buying and selling system. But just because that happens to be the case doesn't mean it always have to be the case. We take the viewpoint, you must get hold of that state machine in order to protect yourself. And the only way to do that in modern society is democratically through the ballot box. Plus the fact, of course, that it's very difficult to project about the future. As I said, we've not got this crystal ball. It's a pity, perhaps. Maybe it's not such a pity. Maybe too frightening to look at. But the thing about it is that what we can say is certain definite things. That in the past, when the owning class thought they were threatened, for instance, in the Paris Commune, when they had the state machine, they very ruthlessly suppressed the working class. And in areas like the USSR, where the Bolshevik Party got hold of the state machine, they used that to ruthlessly crush the old Bolsheviks in such uprisings as the Kronstadt and so on, or attempts by areas such as the Ukraine to secede, which they were allowed to do according to the legal constitution. Well, they were ruthlessly crushed because the state machine was in the hands of their new masters. So we think it's extremely important that the working class organised politically to get hold of that machinery of government.
Well, I just wondered really whether you thought there were any particular reasons why people who work in the state machine should be less able to recognise their interests as members of the working class than as well.
I don't think there's any reasons for that, no? I don't think so. See, I don't take the viewpoint that some people take, that all policemen are pigs, all soldiers are hired assassins and so on. Many of them may be rather nasty individuals. In fact, I can vouch for a few of them, unfortunately. But nevertheless, looking at it from a class viewpoint, policemen are members of the working class, and they work for wages. That's their position.
I'm from the United States. It just seems to me the argument you make that the working class is still in favor of capitalism reminds me of the argument of the southern slaveholders, which said that the reason they had slaves was the slaves were happy with slavery. But in fact, the working class is fed up with capitalism. It is in my country, and it is here, and it is elsewhere. And the struggle is on to what to do about it. And that's what I came here to hear. I think people are searching, and we're searching wherever we can. And that I think the direction forward for us is to hear what you have to say and to hear what whoever else represents socialism and to study the classics of socialism. And in that struggle, we'll find the way out. But I think it's a real mistake and an insult to the working class to say that the majority of the working class favors or supports or accepts capitalism. The struggle is deeply rooted in the class to get rid of capitalism.
Well, I'm not trying to insult the working class at all. In fact, the Socialist Party of Great Britain are the only political party that doesn't insult the working class. We don't say these problems are too difficult for you to understand and leave it to us as the great leaders. That's not our viewpoint at all. On the contrary, we take the viewpoint that only the working class can bring about socialism. But there's an awful lot of evidence, isn't there, that the working class, far from being all in favour of socialism, and somehow they're not getting it because of some bad leader or because of some misdirection. On the contrary, the evidence seems to be that they're in favour of it. They're not in favour of war, they're not in favour of poverty, and they're not in favour of crime. And they complain about these things. Yes, of course they do. But nevertheless, the evidence is there that in fact they support capitalism. I mean, over a year ago, the majority of the working class in this country went to the polls. They voted for the Tory party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, the Scottish, the Welsh Nationalist, Communist Party, the Liberal Party. They voted for all those political parties that are in favour of the buying and selling social system. Last week, the American working class went to the poll and voted for the Republican and Democratic Party. I know there was other parties, but those two major political parties, all of whom heavily committed to the buying and selling system. So the evidence would seem to be to me that the majority of the working class are in favour of capitalism. And I think in Germany, not so long ago, a couple of weeks ago, they had an election and so on and so on. And in Russia, there's no evidence that the majority there want world socialism. On the contrary, they seem to be in favour of their group, a national owning class, still holding control over the means of production and distribution. Likewise in China and elsewhere. The evidence to me seems overwhelming that the majority of the working class think that anything other than the buying and selling system is crazy.
Just add that the working class, by and large, members of the working class and other poor people didn't vote in the election for either party, Reagan or any of the other parties. That the government and the press would like you to think 50% or 52% of people voted. But that's an exaggeration beyond merit. And maybe 30% of the people in that, perhaps 10 or 15% of the working class participated in the election. But in addition to that, the working class workers in general don't participate in their trade unions, and that's a genuine problem, which is different from not participating in the political parties, I think. But by and large, the great majority of the working people are fed up with what they understand the system is and are looking for a way out. And that way out will be socialism when the struggle is successful. And I think that you exaggerate the adherence to capitalism. I don't know on principle a lot here in this country and certainly around the world that the working people of the world do not embrace and accept and idolize capitalism. They're fighting in what ways they can against it, and one day will succeed in that fight, and that will be the ushering in of socialism.
Well, see, I think it might be worthwhile to have a look at some of those figures you're talking about. You just reckon that only something like 30% of the electorate in the USA voted. Well, unless there is distortion, I know newspapers is distortion, I understand a much higher figure than that. But the one I will take you to task on is that only 15% of the working class voted. Because in the United States of America, like all developed capitalist countries, over 90% of the population are members of the working class. That's important, this one. What is a class? In other words, we think that doctors and lawyers and university professors are just as much members of the working class as street sweepers or labourers or people who happen to be unemployed at present. Because we define the working class as all those men and women who own little or nothing but their ability to work, and who have got to work for a wage, a salary, a commission, and in order to live. Whereas the owning class, a very small handful of the population, less than 10% probably in a country such as the USA, who own and control the means of producing and distributing wealth, and who don't have to work in order to live, but can live off rent, interest, and profit. I mean, that class division exists throughout the globe, and depending on its historical and social development, it roughly goes round about a ratio of 90%, 10%. Some places it's not as marked as that, some places it's even more marked than that. But nevertheless, that is the class structure of it. And the people who didn't vote in that election, it wasn't the fact they didn't vote in that election because they were fed up with capitalism and they wanted world socialism. If only that was the case. I mean, the World Socialist Party of the United States, which puts out their newspaper, the Western Socialists, a very small organisation with very little support in the United States of America. Likewise, our companion parties throughout the globe. And that's where our evidence comes from it. I mean, when I go into a public house, or I go into my work, or I go to dancing, or I go to a club, and I sit just talking to people, I don't get the impression that I want to abolish the wages system. No, unless maybe I went to a conference at Clapham High Street, the Socialist Party of Great Britain, and didn't know I was in that particular public house, and think, good God, this is the game, this. Everybody's talking about it. But I know from my own practical, bitter experience, I wish it wasn't the case. The majority of the working class, unfortunately, know of no alternative to the buying and selling system. And the 99% attitude at first hearing to the case for world socialism is, oh, well, without money, that's crazy. It's true what you say, though, and I've got to give you this, and it's one of the things for optimism in the world socialist movement. People don't like what's happening, but then you'd have to be insane to like to know a third of the world's population starving while food's destroyed. You'd have to be mad to be glad what's happened in Iraq and Iran. You'd have to be crazy to say, well, that's really good news from Cambodia, wouldn't you? Or what's going on in El Salvador. I mean, unless you come out of the confines of an insane asylum, you must be displeased, to say the least, of what's happening in the world. It's poverty and it's crime and all the rest of it. But that doesn't make you a socialist. That doesn't make you determined to get rid of capitalism. It's a start, but only the first feeble start. That's that discontent.
I just want to go back to the point American comments later in relation to the fact that you said that the working class is in favour of capitalism. Surely the real fact of the matter is that the working class aren't allowed access to, shall we say, socialist ideas and attitudes and literature. And really that's the cause of the problem. It's not necessarily that they're inherently for capitalism, it's just that, for example, here at college, we can join socialist groups and read magazines, etc. But your average working class person who works 40 hours in a factory hasn't the means or the access to these alternative political ideas. And therefore, really, that's the problem. And it's not really a case of the working class being for capitalism. It's just that they haven't had the chance to look at an alternative idea, really.
Well, I have some sympathy with what you're saying, but how true is it in the long run, what you're saying? I mean, there's no, as far as I'm aware, that there's no evidence to suggest that people in universities are more acquainted with the case for world socialism than those outside it. Far from it. I don't see much evidence for that. And I never went to a university. Many members of the Socialist Party of Great Britain or the World Socialist Party of the United States of America didn't manage to get to a university. I got thrown out of school when I was 15. But nevertheless, I had access. I worked in a factory, I worked in buses, I worked in offices. I had access to what was happening round about me. In the days of the newspaper, the radio, and nowadays the television, it would have to be a rather badly informed person who wasn't aware that something like a third of the population is starving. You don't have to go to university to know that. Nor if you're a member of the working class and you're working these hours in a factory. And I don't think there's many of them working 14 hours a day now. There may be some, right enough. But they're well aware of the problems. The problem is poverty. That's why so many people do the football pools. That's why many people get into the alcohol or the hash or the cocaine or whatever. Well, it's a bit dear, that, right enough. But get into whatever they can to try and get a bit of relief from it. Now, they don't need a university education to be aware of the fact that they're poor. And we think that as capitalism develops, those contradictions between poverty and riches, those major contradictions between what society can produce and how it's dealing with the majority of the population, they become more and more obvious. They become more and more widely known. It's quite true what you say, of course, that access to information is limited in the sense that the major daily newspapers are owned by capitalist groups who are not liable to put out the case for world socialism. That the television and the radio and so on are owned either by private individuals or owned by the state. And of course the ideas that they put out on political matters will be bland, complacent and orthodox. But nevertheless, during the time when the Roman Catholic Church in feudalic England held sway over all propaganda, that didn't mean that because they had control of the propaganda machinery, they were the only men that could read or write at one stage. It didn't mean that ideas didn't change. Because as a means that a production developed, then new ideas about the world that people lived in came about. That's how we had a capitalist revolution throughout Europe. Because the means of production in turn leads to new ideas, new concepts about social relationships and how man stands in relationship with the rest of the world. And that's exactly how socialist ideas develop. As a means of production develops, the concept of scarcity amongst plenty, the concept of class ownership, and that becomes more obvious inside the university and outside it. So although it's true we'd like to have more information and be able to put out more information about it, we don't take the pessimistic viewpoint that as long as the owning class control the major propaganda machinery that we're doomed. On the contrary, we think that these ideas, socialist ideas, are in line with new developments and will never be stopped. Short of course, of a nuclear holocaust. Short of that, there's no way that the ideas of socialism won't develop and won't become more and more easily accessible to people.
Okay, I'm from the same student London, a demonstration especially to understand the roads transport through London. We were reading obviously it's very dangerous and out but also interesting to see meeting social freedom arms of the march, which are full information regarding the effects of the contained breach and details of how to deal with such a breach was published. And And I think that local authorities are given high levels of control and also information regarding the dangers and the possibilities. And the main thing is that the various authorities in control are just not producing any information. And when they do produce information, it's generally pretty scarce. And it's just not good enough. It's very worrying. And the next usually they're not giving information, but they don't really know enough to be able to find out the there's few leaflets which I just like to give out now. It's like about them. But I just wondered if you want to read out demands of March.
What is on the leaflet?
It's not. Can I just quickly read out showing the full information regarding sexual orientation, details of the plan to deal with such frequent population. The more stringent tests are carried out in the product container, and that the ability of these containers to sit up to remove intentional damage from them. Not wherever possible, nuclear gently to stop shortage of information. Nuclear waste trains will be rerouted to avoid mass evacuation. And radiation monitoring will work into contact with those containers. We found in the transport of nuclear waste on the same trains, it's corrosive and flammable, and it causes damage. And speed restrictions will be imposed on the trains. The speed limits will be lowered to ensure both containers remain intact in the event of serious rollover activity. The public, especially, must important thing. The public inquiry be held into the entire matter of nuclear waste transport in the UK. So the language just isn't coming out. In many areas.
Well, sure, there's a few things I'd like to say about that. You know, for instance, there's nothing new about it. The question of the nuclear thing is new, of course, in relation to the past. But I mean, way back in the last century, the proposition about injurious materials, explosive materials and so on, to members of the working class was in the news, as it were. And of course, umpteen people have died, thousands of people have died from cancer and all the rest of it, because their work conditions, and there's been these awful accidents, miners die and all the rest of it. Now, the thing about that is all efforts to deal with that. Some of them are successful. For instance, if you read, and no doubt you have read, the Hammonds, the Bleak Age about the 1840s in this country, where actually a legislation was passed about sanitation and so on. But here we've got a problem of capitalism, which basically arises from the fact that they're looking for cheap methods of fuel, of power. And at the same time, of course, they're always trying to cheapen that production. And it's cheaper to bury it somewhere or to think rather than take any real precautions. Actually, there is some doubt whether in fact there is any safe way to get rid of this stuff anyway. But granted that you've got a social system such as capitalism where people aren't important. But the important thing is cheapen production and to try and increase your profit yield. Then these efforts are reforming a specific problem of capitalism. Are taking up the efforts of men and women of the working class, very sincere, I'm not doubting that proposition. But of course the thing is that is the cheapest means of producing this destruction. It's very necessary in a competitive society. So all those efforts and all those thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and all those signatures and all those very emotive demonstrations have done nothing. Basically nothing. Now we're at the situation where I think the other day in that Dimbleby programme was something like 4 tons of TNT for every human being on Earth stockpiled. We're into the situation of what they laughingly call overkill. And this problem will carry on as long as we'll get production for profit. So I'd ask you, rather than concern yourself with a specific problem of capitalism, either the growing crime rate, the bad housing, the lack of education, the health hazards of nuclear waste, the health hazards of all sorts of materials that members of the working class are asked for, all on the face of it, worthwhile efforts. That in fact what you're dealing with is you're dealing with a problem atomistically. You're dealing with it piecemeal, one bit at a time. And even should you have some limited success in this particular area, then of course there's all these other areas that you've had to ignore in order to deal with that specific problem. Whereas we think, if you're going to really be a problem solver here, you're going to have to deal with the cause of them, which is production for profit. It's a class-divided society that produces these problems. And the real practical way to deal with this is rather than protest about a specific aspect of capitalism, is organised to get rid of the cause of those problems. Yeah, well, there's been no evidence to suggest that campaigns for one specific issue has led to a growing socialist consciousness. See, here, for instance, is a man, I'm quoting out a Canadian publication by our party called the Socialist Fulcrum. It's a man called Samuel Epstein, a doctor, wrote a book called The Politics of Cancer. He said this: if 1,000 people died every day of cholera, swine flu, or food poisoning, an epidemic of major proportions would be at hand, and the entire country would mobilise against it. Yet cancer claims that many lives daily, and most people believe they can do nothing about it. Now, it said cancer pessimism would probably not be altered by knowing that 70 to 90% of all cancer is made by man-made poisons in the environment and is preventable. But the reason they don't do it is it's the cheapest way to deal with it. And that's it. Now, here's a man who could claim, and I'm not too sure here, I've not read the book, but he's talking about the United States death rate of about 1,000 people, he thinks, preventable, dying every year because of the use of these pollutions, these poisons. That's happening every day. Now, no doubt he could come along and say, well, I'm not saying he is, I've not read the book, but he could be saying, let's organise and let's demonstrate against this specific issue. Now, having done that, and probably been unsuccessful, going by the record so far I am attempting to do this, having done that, that wouldn't have made people say, aye, this is another example of capitalism, let's organise for world socialism. And we think they're much better than dealing with that in a limited area. I mean, this is what reformist parties do all the time, and have been doing for a couple of 100 years. Maybe back in 1840, a man called Shaftesbury introduced a programme to abolish the housing problem. But of course, still got it. All that effort was put into that, and all that enthusiasm was engendered to it. But what it meant was that the buying and selling system carried on. So we feel, as members of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, on this particular proposition, that all that sincerity and all that effort, so I'm not down as 100% authentic, should be directed towards the major problem, the real cause of the problem, world capitalism. And that's how we feel, and that's why the Socialist Party don't go out on limited objectives such as halting nuclear waste dumping or halting pollutants or something of that nature.
I was wondering if you could develop more detail how socialist structures will be set up. Would it be industrialised? Would it be done by
Yeah. Well, what we can say about world socialism is this, and in a sense it's rather negative, but we'll start off with the negative parts of it. We can say that there would be no owners and non-owners. In other words, the whole means of production and distribution would be owned in common. There'd be no buying nor selling, there'd be no rent, interest, profit, wages, pensions, or any of these things. What there would be is men and women combining their energies to produce wealth to the best of their ability and taking according to their needs. That's what we mean by world socialism. The question of the amount of industrialisation and the question of how that society would be operated would be up to the individuals concerned. In other words, what would happen would be is not only have we got common ownership, we've got democratic control. Should the majority of people not wish to live in cities, then there would be no cities. It may be inside a socialist society that some would decide to do that. It may be, of course, that if a modern city inside a socialist society could be a beautiful place to live. It'll be up to people to make those decisions. what we can say is this, that every means of technical advance that would anyway lessen repetitive or dangerous toil would be utilised. It wouldn't be a question of returning to the ox-drawn plough or anything like that. If electronic advances can get rid of the back-breaking work, then it means that human beings can engage in activities that they find more pleasant. The important thing would be human needs. And I mean, I can't envisage a society, and how am I to know about this, but I can't envisage a society where anybody would ask to do anything as awful as go down mines and go up there wasting water or carry on in any of that fashion. These things would be mechanised. I wouldn't do it, so I couldn't ask anybody else to do it. Nor would there be any of the dangerous, dirty, horrible things that men have got to do, that is, learn to torture and kill and maim people. There'd be none of that. So it's difficult for us to draw up a picture of world socialism. In 1904, when the Socialist Party of Great Britain was formed, I don't know what socialists would have said. What could he have said? We say everybody will have a handsome cab, everybody will have their own gas mantle in the house. I don't know what they would say. But obviously the potential of modern society is immense, and I don't pretend to be any expert on that. What little I do know is for organisations like the United Nations, that it's possible just now, the potential exists to feed the world 3 times over. Now, we've not got that just now. A third of the world's population is undernourished. It would be possible inside a socialist society for people to live in decent homes instead of the carry-on we've got now. So it's difficult for me to say exactly how it would operate. All I can make is a couple of suggestions, and you might have better ones. The one, for instance, that used to be a stumbling block for some of our opponents, how would you have this democratic control? I mean, would we all have to meet in a big park somewhere and vote on every other issue? It wouldn't seem possible to have a democracy like that. But as we all know, with the advance of electronics, it's now possible, and is used as a commercial proposition in the United States of America, as yet not fully developed, whereby you flick through your TV screen and see all the things that you want, or rather things you can afford, and then you press a couple of buttons, and then that's delivered to you, along with a bill, of course, a couple of days later. And not only can you receive information, you can feed information in. Now, technically, there's nothing to stop us having a situation where everybody on earth, for all practical reasons, would be capable of recording what they felt about a specific local or global situation. I mean, the advance of electronics and associated sciences has made it possible to have this. I mean, I'm not here to give you an Isaac Asimov picture of the future, other than to state the basic proposition that we would common ownership, production for use, and people would cooperate to produce the best of their ability and take account of their needs. The fashion in which they would organise it, it's not up for an old deadhead of me who's had 44 years living inside capitalism. It's for the people of that specific time. I mean, it's going to be their society, isn't it? And they have as much say on it as anybody else. Everybody will have a say in what happens, and it's up to society to decide what happens.
I just want to get back, because I thought there's something hanging that was real. The question was, here's the working class who doesn't need capitalism. I say they don't want it, and they're trying to get rid of it. But clearly we all agree the working class doesn't benefit from capitalism. And the question is, what do you do? And it seemed like the suggestion was, well, we'll do our literature and whatever else, and the class will develop its consciousness and make socialism. And a friend here said, but there's no access to the needed ideas. And I think that's not quite right. I think there's no clarity of those ideas. I don't know what I meant, but there's no clarity of those ideas. I think there's a question of the struggle. I think that the speaker, and perhaps the Socialist Party, doesn't see it as a question of struggle. It's a hard struggle for the working class to find its way out of capitalism, to fight its way out of capitalism. And it's not a question of access so much of ideas. The voice of the working class isn't being heard, because there's no journal vehicle to get into. The working class will generate its own and has up and down in the past. But it's a vigorous struggle at every twist and turn, and that struggle can be helped for whoever wants to be of help to it by clarifying the ideas and the understandings of the laws of development of capitalism. And that struggle is ongoing. The struggle over the concept of value started with Petty, a long time ago, and was developed through Ricardo. And Ricardo did a great deal of work, but he left it contradictory, and some of that contradiction was solved by Marx, and that should be studied. That clarification of those ideas will give strength to the working class moving forward. There is something to do. I get the feeling that there's nothing to do from this presentation of Socialist Party of Great Britain. That there's a fierce struggle to enter into and to support.
Sure, well, I agree with that, of course. I'm not saying that the last word in world socialism has been written, that when Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels died, that was the end of it, and that we somehow or other are the disciples or the protectors of this socialist purity. I'm not claiming that. But what I'm claiming is this, that the ideas of world socialism have been formulated, the basis of the ideas of world socialism have been formulated. They're workable propositions. Not a question here so much of studying, although it's always worth studying. Not so much a question of studying the labour theory of value and any advances we can make on it. It's a question of applying that labour theory of value to modern day society. Does it work? Is it the answer? Is world socialism the answer? Now we, of course, don't think there is nothing to be done. I mean, if we think there's an awful lot to be done, I mean, the very fact that there's only relatively here a handful of people at this meeting means that we've got an awful lot to do. But I mean, there are physical and mental limits to what a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain can do. I happen to work in the railway as a clerk. It takes up most of my time doing that, and I'm not making this special pleading. I think this applies to every member of the working class. And it's just a normal day-to-day living that you've got to do. You've got to prepare to go to your work. You've got to rest and all the rest of it. It doesn't leave you a great deal of spare time, and it's only in your recreation that you can do something about this. But we're very conscious of the fact that what we need is not just more literature, but better literature. That what we need is not just more publicity, but better literature. We should have had thousands of posters for this meeting. We should have had umpteen newspaper adverts. We should have had a better speaker. We should have had a speaker with a lot of illustrations here. We should have used modern methods in order to communicate these ideas. So in a sense, because of the poverty of the working class, we perhaps are in an electronic age and we're still using rather prehistoric methods. But that's not because we've got the idea that nothing better can be done. It's all we have at hand at present. What we've got at hand, we're doing the best we have with our limited resources. And that's why we beg you to seriously consider the case of joining up with us, because we think we're the only organisation in this country that's committed to world socialism, that has an answer. All right, it can improve its case, and I don't doubt that for one instant. But that has got to be part of the process that world's working class plays. It's not going to have to be Dick Donnelly here, or the chairman here, or some member sitting at the back of the hall. No doubt they could be better socialists, and better informed socialists, more accomplished socialists, be able to put their ideas across. That's a process they'll have to set themselves to. But nevertheless, even if we were not all the brightest people in the world, the thing about it is, if a majority of the working class were in a position of understanding the basic proposition of world socialism, we could get it tomorrow. What's stopping us just now is not the question that we've not refined our Marxism, honed it up to a fine edge. What's wrong at present is we've not got the membership. And that's what we are desperate need now, is more socialists.
Yes, my point was similar to what my colleague raised up. I tend to feel that the Socialist Party of Great Britain presents very nice points of view, but is unfortunately living in a world of its own. You have to be realistic. It's no good just thinking about all these wonderful thoughts of world socialism. We have to get things done. And this is why I feel that the Labour Party and other major parties are the best vehicle to see such change. All right, so in the past we haven't seen much socialism from the Labour Party or any other socialist party throughout the world. But at least this is constructive, and at least we may, as time goes by, we may see some change result from these various political parties. The Socialist Party of Great Britain is not doing enough. I appreciate your difficulties, but you must try and get more constructive things done.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's true, you see, it depends what kind of things you want to be done. I mean, as far as we're concerned, the thing that the Labour Party's done is the working class. I just mentioned in passing the record, but look at it. It supported 2 world wars. The Socialist Party was opposed to them. And by the way, the Socialist Party were doing things then as well. They were out in the streets shouting against it, producing literature against it, and arguing against workers taking part in those particular holocausts. The Labour Party were doing things okay. They'd done things like nationalise the railways and half the amount of workers that were in it. The Labour Party have done things like bringing out the troops against gas workers, jailing some gas workers because they were on strike. They've brought out the troops in the docks. I mean, these are things that they've done. There's no doubt about it. They've been a power political party. But they're exactly the same sort of things that the Communist Party and the Tory and the Liberal and the Nazi Party were doing. Now, that's surely not the things you want done. Here are the only things that the Socialist Party of Great Britain has done. It's kept the case for socialism clear. It's never compromised the case for socialism. It's propagated it as best it can during such things as general strikes and depressions and world wars. It's put forward a clear case for world socialism. Now, as far as we're concerned, that's socialist activity. That activity that's indulged in by the Labour Party, the Communists and the Tories and all the rest of them, is reformist activity. And the things that they're getting done, there's no things that we want to get done. The thing they're basically doing is they're the practical men that are running capitalism. And after all that effort, and by the way, I would say that the majority of supporters of the Labour Party are honest, decent men and women of the working class who sincerely believe that somehow or other the Labour Party is a bit different. But the facts are all against that attitude. The facts are there that the Labour Party's record is a stinking anti-working class one. So how could we possibly support it? There's no difference between them as far as we're concerned and the Tory Party as far as how they deal with the working class. So, while we might criticise the Socialist Party about not doing enough, I think that nevertheless we've got to say that what we have done is in line with socialist principles. What they've done is in line with capitalist expediency.
Well, I was going to say that one of the pamphlets of the Socialist Party has a quotation from the man who was the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, called Lord Houghton. He said in 1967, he's a Lord, because they've been abolishing the House of Lords for a long time.
Well,
what he said was, never has any previous government done so much in so short a time to make modern capitalism work. He was referring, incidentally, to the 1964 Labour government. Now, I don't accept, I mean, apart from the terms that the Speaker has mentioned, that we are limited by the amount of members we've got, the amount of money we've got, and the amount of ability we've got. I don't accept for a moment that the Socialist Party of Great Britain is an inactive organisation. In fact, I would go as far as to say that by looking at most objective standards of activity, you would find this organisation be more active than almost any others that speak about any kind of dissent from capitalism. If you look in the journal Time Out any week, which is the only one that advertises political meetings in the London area, you'll find more meetings organised by the SPGB in that than any other political party in the London area. You'll find a lot of meetings organised by all kinds of immediate reform campaigns, but as a general political party, more organised by us. If you look in this college, more meetings have been organised by the Socialist Party of Great Britain than any other political party. In fact, I would say than perhaps all of the other political parties put together. More general statements of what this party stands for have been put forward than the other parties. More sales of the party journal than the other parties. This has been done, and it's done because people have to put in hard work. And it seems to me a rather odd position as someone who is presumably in some agreement with what we're doing, because you're saying we should do more, but at the same time, insufficiently in agreement to come and help us do the work. It would seem that the most useful way in which you could support the work that this party is doing is by joining it and doing it as well. But it seems to me that in a lot of universities in particular, and amongst a lot of the people who regard themselves as the leaders of the working class, there are people who see themselves, who not only happen to have a theory that the working class is not capable of understanding socialism, because that after all is what they have learned from Lenin, who said that the working class was too stupid to understand what socialism is about. But having adopted the theory, it just so happens they find that they are members of that particular group who are cut out for leadership. You don't often hear people talking about the inevitability and necessity of leadership when they reckon that they're one of the sheep who are going to do the following. It's always the ones who are going to be the leaders, so much so that somebody once came up with the slogan that students can only manage to reach a Leninist consciousness, which was an adaptation of something that Lenin once said. If you look at the way in which this leadership operates, where has it got people? What, in fact, has been the impact of that leadership? It has resulted in a lot of people looking towards people who stand above them to give them their answers, a lot of people who feel that they have succeeded in their reform campaigns because they've managed to get whatever reform they were after, and a lot of people who have been so frustrated by not getting what they wanted in their reform campaigns that they become acquiescent, and there you had the beginnings of support a few years ago during a serious capitalist crisis for the National Front, and even now you get many people who were one-time supporters of the Labour Party because they thought it was radical, who now find themselves supporting the Tories because, quite rightly in many respects, they see that the Tory party is at least more experienced and more open about wanting to run a vicious competitive system in a ruthless manner. And that has been the legacy of reformism, there is no doubt about it. And however much our friend may want to, argue his way around this, American workers went out in the elections last week and they voted for Ronald Reagan, and if they didn't vote for him, they voted for Carter. And if they didn't vote if they didn't vote for either of them, it was not because they regarded that what was required was a complete change of society. It was because they were so acquiescent and so apathetic and so unconcerned with democratic change in society that they took no part in it at all. And what socialists are saying is it is, of course, a good thing if very often workers do say to hell with a lot of them and a plague on both their houses and whatever else. That is a very useful thing. But what is much more important is if, having made that decision, you go out and do something about it. You actually organise your alternative political views. You state where it is that you disagree with the major political parties. And by and large, what has happened is that most people who regard themselves as radicals either try to fit themselves in one of the political parties, and if it's not the Labour Party, then it's one of the Leninist parties, and if it's not that, then, and they're really down on their luck, it might even be the Liberal Party. Either they are doing that, or else the people who didn't vote in the American election last week were not sitting at home reading up and saying, Marx has certainly improved on that theory of value from Ricardo. He's come up with a few good points here. Far from it. They were sitting at home watching Walter Cronkite or whatever he's called, or Mickey Mouse, or one of the other alternative political viewpoints that are put on for the working class. That's what they were doing, and that is the situation we have to face. The majority of workers, if you go out into the street now, as a speaker has absolutely rightly said, and has probably much greater experience of finding this out than I have. You used to talk to people, an alternative to government, an alternative to having to sell yourself for a wage or a salary, an alternative to producing bread for a profit, taking bread for nothing, running your own life, not having to do what your trade union leader tells you or what your boss tells you. People are not accepting that point of view. And that's what socialists have to do. And that is the one thing we have done. And as the speaker pointed out, in the First World War, socialists who didn't fight in that war ended up in prisons between 1914 and 1918. And it was incidentally the law of this country that if you didn't fight in the First World War, you lost your right to vote after the First World War. They were disenfranchised from even having the right to do that. Many people during the 19 blacklisted, weren't allowed to go out and get a job because their employers said these people are against the system we stand for. This party now has been disregarded by all kinds of people, has been sneered at, its members have been the subject of all kinds of political abuse. In the university system, its members have been discriminated against at work. Members who didn't fight in the last war were refused the right to stand even as trade union officials. I was at a meeting in Manchester a few months ago where a member was telling me that as a result of being part of the opposition to the last war, the opposition to supporting Churchill, his own trade union blacklisted him as ever having the right to stand as a trade union official for many years afterwards. These are the things that are happening. When this party was opposing the Stalinist regime in Russia, when all of the radicals were lining up in support of Comrade Stalin, what happened? Our platforms were being smashed up. In the 1930s, the Daily Worker published an editorial saying that it was official party policy not to speak to members of the SPGB in case you become contaminated by their anti-Stalinism. It was also unofficial party policy to smash up the platforms of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. So that on the one side, it was those people who supported the last war and who supported all of the atrocities of warfare who were smashing up our platform because they said we were pacifists. And on the other side, the people who were smashing up our platform were the supporters of Stalin. So this is the record of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, a record of not only having supported fascism in its most overt sense, when it's fashionable to do so, but opposing every limitation upon democracy, including the most tragic limitation on democracy of all, and that is the denial of human beings to have the right over their own decisions about how they will contribute to society and how they will have access to the wealth produced by society. That is a tremendous record of this party. And whilst in no sense am I complacent or smug about the SPGB's position, about the small numbers who attend this meeting, and about the fact that very few people are committed socialists, committed revolutionaries, committed Marxists, whilst we're not smug about that and we're very critical of our own efforts, I think that what we have said in way of consistency, correctness and accurate prediction about how capitalism would work has been something which is a record certainly in no way to be sneered at or to be disregarded.
I just want to make one sort of statement question. In my country, the people who call themselves revolutionary and radicals all say, we'd have a revolution, except the working class is racist and sexist, and so when they wash out this racism and sexism, then we can have a revolution. Now, it seems in this country, the SPGB says, well, the working class is unconscious of itself as a class, or unconscious of, doesn't understand socialism. When it does understand socialism, we'll have socialism. So the problem in the world, according to the revolutionaries in my country and to the SPGB, is that the working class is the problem. It's either their racism, their sexism, or their unconsciousness. And the working class is not the problem, they're the solution. And they're struggling very hard to come forward with that solution. They need the clarity. That clarity is going to be developed through the struggle. And this total attack from everybody who calls themselves revolutionary on the working class betrays what class that attack is coming from. It's coming from the opposite class. And it's not how much work you do, it's who you're doing the work for. And it's what work you're doing. And this is not the work, telling the working class how ignorant it is, how apathetic, how it goes and votes, when the facts are it didn't vote. It didn't vote because it had nothing to vote for. The reason it has nothing to vote for, we can get into that also. But the reality is the working class is in motion. That's why we're here talking, because there's something pushing us behind us. And when we clarify it, they'll join with us and we'll join with them. If we can't clarify what we're doing, if we can't clarify that it's relevant and that it helps the class to understand itself and move forward, then we're not going to be accepted by the class. And they'll go their own way and make the revolution.
Offence to come back, more or less the same point again. Well, see, our viewpoint is that all these things that you call radical and socialist, you know, it very much depends who you mean by that and what actions you're talking about. I mean, you can do a lot of things. You can have demonstrations and you can do a lot of things like, there's all sorts of organisations in this country that use the term very, very loosely and call themselves socialist this or socialist that and revolutionary this and revolutionary that. But the point about them all is they're all wanting to run the buying and selling system. Socialists can't combine with men and women, whether they're the working class or not, whose idea is that they're going to run capitalism, that we're going to have a money society. Their idea of a change, no matter what it may be, and they all vary to some extent, we're still going to have buying and selling relationships. We can't possibly combine with them. In our view, the only revolutionary stance you can take is the abolition of the wages system. Now, we don't take the viewpoint that we sneer at the working class and all the rest of it. You reiterated that again. But as I say, all our meetings are open to the public, and all our meetings are open to the widest possible discussion. Far from sneering at them, we are very, very much aware of the fact that the only class that will bring about world socialism is the working class, that the Socialist Party of Great Britain by itself cannot bring about world socialism. What needs is a conscious action of a majority, a class-conscious workers. But that's not to mean that we'll combine with anybody who's in the working class or combine with anybody who loosely uses the term socialism. We think that only leads to confusion. And unfortunately, it's not the case, as you keep making out, that there's a majority of the working class who are fed up with this system. There is absolutely no evidence for that. I only wish you were correct. How much easier our job would be. So, that although you're taking the attitude that here's a small organisation, the Socialist Party of Great Britain, and its companion parties elsewhere, who are saying, look, we're right, and everybody else is out of step, that this is some sort of arrogance or bombast. It's not arrogance or bombast. I mean, we're prepared to argue the proposition. We're not just dogmatically stating something. The Labour Party have shown that they're in favour of nationalisation. Nowhere have they ever opposed the wars. Nowhere have they ever said they're in favour of the abolition of the wages system. Likewise, those other parties that you loosely call radicals and socialists, they're not socialist at all. So therefore, we can't combine them. Just this mere activity of you're doing something, that's the answer. That's blind and foolish. What is called for is thought. What's needed is action, but thoughtful action. Action in line with how capitalism develops. Action in line with the next stage in social evolution, the abolition of the wages system and institution of common ownership. Now, I'd like to say in conclusion, fellow workers, that although we've had a lot of questions here, I don't know, 12, 13, some 14, something like that, I would like to say that the socialist case at first hearing might appear a bit bizarre. Even at second or third hearing, there may be large areas where you're in disagreement with us, and that is understandable. This case for socialism, unfortunately, is not self-evident. It needs a bit of inquiry. I beg you to start off with a bit of that inquiry. Get hold of the literatures. As the chairman says, I'm not expecting people to turn up at 3 meetings a day. That's just a wee bit too much. I'm not asking you to do that. But, you know, wherever it's possible, because we've all got our own lives to live, wherever possible, go along and engage in discussion with members of the Socialist Party. I can assure you, far from sneering it, we desperately need your support, and your very active support at that. With that, I'd like to thank you for a very kind and attentive hearing, most of all for your questions and your points of view. I've enjoyed it. Good afternoon.